What's up, everybody? Jesse from Plant the Spear here. Excited to be back in the studio with you guys. And I am joined by a special guest. We've been trying to put this together for at least a year now, and we finally have got ourselves together on the same video. I am pleased to be joined by Norvell Central, probably the hardest working man in Florida State media. I can't even fathom how he puts out as much content as he does, quality stuff. And just Norvell Central, Taylor, thank you for being on.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunities. You do a tremendous job on Plant the Spirit as well. I love the content. I love seeing other Florida State fans just interacting with those guys. And man, it's a pleasure.
I appreciate that. And so what we're going to do tonight is, we're so close. I mean, we're so close you can taste football. It is less. I mean, you got week 0 coming up this weekend. It doesn't really scratch the itch like a top 10 matchup does next weekend with Florida State. But we're going to go ahead and just kind of talk about the season as a whole. We're so close. There's no point in, back and forth with a bunch of stuff. It's time to get into the meat and potatoes. It is time to go. So we're just going to talk a little bit about expectations, some goals we'd like to see, and kind of how we see this season playing out. And so I'll go ahead and kind of start off a few things here looking at Florida State. And I think one thing that I want to do first is let's just set the stage a little bit. So obviously we know how 2022 went, 10-win season. Florida State beat the rivals, the two in-state rivals. And I made a joke the other day. I said after the last few years, like it was cleansing for the soul to watch Florida State run Miami out of their own rented stadium. That was it was so nice. And so, 10 wins is not where Florida State wants to be, but they have a lot to prove. And this is a really pivotal season, what I feel at Florida State, because you're coming out of a rebuild period. You have a top 5 recruiting class right now. Your in-state rivals are kind of down a little bit. There was year 1. We don't know if they're going to recover yet. So Florida State really has a chance to kind of grab things by the horns and kind of get themselves back to where they want to be. And so looking at Florida State, we're going to start with the schedule. I had this broken down into home and away opponents. So obviously on the schedule, we have Duke, Syracuse, Virginia Tech, Southern Miss, North Alabama, and Miami at home. Then you have a really tough road game against Clemson, a neutral site game against LSU, Pitt, Florida, Wake Forest, and Boston College. And when I talk about some of my expectations for 2023, I'm going to go ahead and put up a slide that I made here. For me personally, it is to get double-digit wins in the regular season. We know they got close last year. I'd like to see them win an ACC title. I know that can be easier said than done if you do have to rematch against Clemson. But to me, that's goal number 1 of 2023 is winning an ACC title for the first time since 2014. Be in contention for the college football playoff. Now, you handle the goal we just talked about, it's probably going to take care of itself. Undefeated at home. I think they have a really good chance to do that. It's time to put the fear of playing back and playing at Doak. And I'd like to see them secure that top 10, top 5 recruiting class because I think, again, it's a pivotal time. So knowing some of the goals that I've laid out, just share some of your thoughts on some of the things you would like to see Florida State accomplish this season. I know people are going to say you didn't put national championship on there. I get it. I'd love to see it happen. I think let's cross that bridge when it gets there. But just let me hear some of your thoughts on some of the goals I have and kind of where you stand on those.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the coffin with the national championship talk. Of course, championships are very hard to come from. There's only, 4 active coaches with national
I
championships
believe
right now at
so.
the moment. It's very hard to do. And, coming off of a Jimbo Fisher-led era, then you go to the Willie Taggart era, didn't really pan out. So now you're kind of navigating over to Mike Norvell. He kind of set a culture and what it meant to be with Florida State at this point. A lot of the doubters and a lot of the Vegas lines had them at 6.5 over/under win. And next thing you know, we're 10-3. Had a tremendous season. You beat both your rivals. You did a really, really good job. But now we're kind of navigating over to 2023, like you said. We have the 2 pivotal matchups that everybody talks about in LSU and Clemson. But the problem is past that, if you're able to get past the month of September, that next part of the stretch, I mean, you have to win the games that you are projected to win at this point. And really, I mean, it's not an overwhelming home schedule. Like you said, Miami is going to be the circle date that a lot of recruits are going to be coming in, a lot of coaches, and a lot of that attention is going to be coming to Tallahassee that weekend. not simply because Miami's that good, but it's because your home stretch is not that great. And I mean, you can say Duke. Duke has done a tremendous job, and that program has kind of went up and done a really phenomenal job. We'll see how they play against Clemson, as you talked about before. But I think getting the idea of a culture set in this program, I think, is very important because let's face it, I mean, you're really going to see your identity in the month of September. Can you be able to weather the storm and figure out everything that's going on there? And plus, we talked about the back half of the schedule that we're kind of going to go over and discuss. Jordan Travis, for example, we know what he is as a quarterback. He's been here for 6 years. But at some point, you have to understand what is life without Jordan Travis. You have to kind of factor that in and say, okay, Tate Rodemaker, are you going to be the answer? Is AJ Duffy going to be the answer? Is Brock Glenn, the quarterback that they have kind of heralded as that type of quarterback, is he going to be the answer? So there's a lot of question marks that you have as a program going forward to 2024. But just in terms of 2023, you have to kind of heighten the expectations right now because Mike Norvell understands that this is a program of Florida State caliber that has the rich history, that has the prestige, and he just wants his players to understand that this is bigger than Florida State at this point. You have to understand what's in front of you and kind of do the best you can with what you have.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And circling back to the national championship thing, this is something that I wrote about in the preseason magazine, which you guys can get on our website. It's almost 60 pages in depth. I went way overboard on some of these, almost 3,000 words on some of these team previews. Go check it out. It's free. But yeah, to win a national championship, I think people, the national championship or bust crowd, really have to take a step back because I think, like you said, it's a perfect thing. Bobby Bowden said in the past, sometimes it's the ball bouncing your way. It's a call going your way. It's injury luck. When Florida State won in 2013, they really didn't have any major injuries. When you look at Georgia last year, it's a perfect example. They won the national championship game by 59 points. If it wasn't a stroke of luck by Ohio State's kicker, who had made 85% of his field goals, shanking a game winner, they never even get the opportunity. So it's hard to do that. And, when you look at technically history, statistically, the answer is, can Florida State win a national championship? The answer is no, because of the blue chip ratio. It's supposed to be above 50%. So I think, to me, the question that I ask for 2023 is, can Florida State make it to the playoffs to get that puncher's chance? Because what's interesting to me when you talk about a national championship and the blue chip ratio and all this stuff is right now transfers aren't factored into that. And we know that Florida State he has built a lot on transfers. And to me, Jared Verse and Jordan Travis are two guys that really embody this. So when you look at Jared Verse, he coming out of high school was a 0-star recruit, rated as a 4-star transfer. Now, why would these services go through and re-rate these players based on college production if they didn't think we should use those ratings? So you have a guy like Jared Verse that doesn't even count towards Florida State's blue chip ratio, but he's projected as a first-round NFL draft pick. That's a 5-star player, in my opinion. You have Jordan Travis, 3-star quarterback, in contention for the Heisman. So I really do think that Florida State is an interesting case scenario for 2023. Can they bust the blue chip standard? Can they be the team to do it? And I think the reason the blue chip thing holds up is, like, when you look at Georgia last year in the national championship, their 4-star tackle gets injured. What do? Bring a 5-star off the bench. Florida State doesn't have that luxury right now. Now, they've built depth, but like you said, you're thin at a few spots. If your talent level falls off a lot farther than those high blue chip teams. So Florida State needs a lot of things to go their way, injury wise and things like that. But I think they have the pieces, and when you look at their starting 22 and not into the depth, their blue chip ratio is better than it may look like on paper. But I do think it's hard. It's hard to win a national championship. And as much as people might not want to hear it, if you look at a team like Clemson last year, I think they finished 11-3. They won the ACC and they played in the Orange Bowl. Man, if Florida State goes 9-0 in the ACC or whatever, or 8-1, gets the revenge in the title game and goes to the Orange Bowl, that's a good season to me. That is perfectly acceptable because that's enough to keep that recruiting class intact. So if Florida State were to go say 11-3 like that, or 12-2 or something like that, be an ACC champion in the Orange Bowl. To me, is that a successful season in your eyes?
Yes, I do think so, and I think it can be also be a possibility if Florida State doesn't win the ACC going to the Orange Bowl, because I quite frankly think Clemson is going to be very, very good this season, regardless of an inexperienced quarterback and new offense coordinator. I definitely think that team is worth mentioning what they have.
Definitely. Yeah, they're still at a 70% blue chip
Yeah.
ratio. And, I do think the interesting thing, and we'll talk about him in a little bit, but I do
Mhm.
think the interesting thing about Clemson is you started to see some of the cracks in the foundation. And I think Dabo heard the noise. He went out and made the coordinator change for offense. Oh, man, Clemson, I made all my slides, for whether who I thought was going to win or lose. I literally have question marks on Clemson because I'm so torn on who's going to win that game. I feel like Florida State can do it,
Yeah.
but they haven't lost the home ACC game since 2016. And
Mhm.
that is ridiculous to think about the road that you have. Now, when you talk about blue chip ratios, obviously that doesn't guarantee you squat. Miami had over 50% last year. Florida had over 50% last year, and they were terrible. Florida State beat 3 teams with a higher blue chip ratio when you factor in LSU as well. Everybody says that roster only had 39 players when he showed up. The only reason you won was it was game one under a new staff. And I said, well, let's look at it like this. First off, your blue chip ratio is 60%. You signed 19 transfers. 5 of your 6 NFL draft picks were already on the roster, not as transfers. That roster had talent. Let's not act like that roster was devoid of talent. So to me, I just think Florida State is going to be a really interesting case. And like you said, if Clemson were to make the playoffs, you could still get in
Mhm.
to an Orange Bowl. And to me, that's still a really successful season for FSU. So the next now, as far as recruiting goes, and I know you cover recruiting very well. You're better at it than I am. You go more in depth than I do. So what kind of season do you feel like Florida State needs to have to lock in that top 5, top 10 class? Because we've seen the
Yeah.
last few years, we won't bring up any names or mention anything. They've lost a couple of their
Yeah.
top guys.
Mhm.
What do you think needs to happen on the field to lock in that class?
Well, personally, I think you kind of have to have an identity on defense. As we've seen with a couple of different staff changes and just the overall defensive staff as it is, they kind of need a little bit more momentum because the offensive staff, you kind of know what they are. Alex Atkins, David Johnson's done a really nice job of getting Danzy and also Davis. There's some promise and potential, and there's promise and potential on defense as well, but I think they're kind of wanting to solidify some of the defensive trenches. I think is very important there, and you're going to have to let Jared Verse and other guys like that as well. Fabian Lovett's got to be healthy. There's just a lot of factors that go into the defensive side of the ball. I think that has to really turn over because I think Florida State, they were what was it, fourth in the passing defense last year.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's very important when you understand that if their defense continues to improve and they showcase what they're made of against LSU and Clemson, and then they kind of, have that momentum kind of going into 8 games for the rest of the season, I think is very important. So, when I look at it, I think, okay, if you're setting a defensive identity as it is, I think you can be able to sell. I don't necessarily think it's all about the wins because I mean, if they go 10-2 or 9-3, I still think they can have a top 10 class. But the problem is if your defense is not really up to par and your offense is scoring 41, 42 points per game, it's not really going to be a great foundation because the offensive identity in recruiting, like for example, Landon Thomas, he's already committed to Florida State, committed over to Georgia, and now he's back with Florida State. You really don't anticipate him leaving the class anymore unless something bad happens at that point. Luke Kromenhawk's been committed and locked in for quite some time. Cam Davis, same situation. There's a lot of offensive guys that are kind of committed to the program at this point. I don't really think there's any kind of worrisome with a KJ Bolden or Charles Lester at this point either. But just overall, those guys are going to have to be able to generate enough excitement on the defense side of the ball because that's just how it's going to be for Florida State as it is. I mean, you have an older staff on that side of the ball too with Randy Shannon and Odell Higgins. There's a couple of guys there, and not saying those guys are bad recruiters. It's just simply having to relate to those kids on a higher level, I think is very important. And I think when you're able to kind of get all those guys together and being able to generate a great recruiting class, I think it's what it's going to have to take for this point.
And I definitely agree with that. I think Florida State really does need to get some dominant defensive tackles in the class, some defensive linemen. You've done pretty good getting Blake Nicholson in at linebacker, but last year's class, I think you need to get some guys there too. But I do agree that a lot of it's the scheme and the things you see on the field, and that's what happened a lot when you saw Jermaine Johnson come in and then sell this to Jared Verse. And I think that's something that you're going to see. And I think that plays true for the offense as well. A lot of times it was, let's face it, it was a hard sell. And everybody knows I've hammered this 100,000 times. The situation that Mike Norvell walked into during a COVID year you're coaching over Zoom. Like that's
Yeah.
an unreal situation to walk into, but it's hard to recruit when you don't have anything to show on the field. So now that you see a Johnny Wilson type receiver, Keon Coleman looks at that and says, "Hey, they can make me like that." You have Jordan Travis, so now it's easy to recruit quarterbacks because you have a high level player. And so I think what you say really does reign true for the defense to see that if you can have high end in the way they can show you on film, this is what we want to do with you. We have now Jermaine Johnson, who's went in the NFL. We've had Jared Verse. Patrick Payton looks like the next great defensive end coming out. So I definitely think that is something that I want to see. And I think that, there's a lot of Adam Fuller haters out there. Let's just call it
Yeah.
what it is. And so I do think it is a big year for them on the
Mm-hmm.
defense to kind of prove it. And, the funny thing, when I was going through doing the magazine, if you use transfer rankings, the defense actually has a higher blue chip ratio than the offense. And we are 10 times more excited about the offense. So I think that's a good thing, good point to transition into talking Florida State offense and defense for 2023, kind of what we think they're going to do. And so when you look at the offense, and I'm going to pop a slide up here real quick, this just kind of covers Florida State in 2023. So returning production is what makes Florida State so dangerous. So their yardage returning is at 82.8%, which is 15th in the country. Your offensive line starts, and man, bless Alex Atkins, 206 combined starts, first in the country. I kind of looked at the 8 or 9 guys I thought could be contributing. They have an average weight of around 314 pounds, so you got size there too. Go ahead and talk about the defense. Tackles, bringing back 67% of their tackles, 43rd in the country. Big play defense, which is your sacks, interceptions, tackles, floss, etc., 78.4%, 10th in the country. The gold box you see up here, PFF 70-plus players. Does this stat mean anything? I don't know. But I saw it on Twitter last year by a Georgia page, and Georgia had the most PFF players graded 70-plus coming back, and they won the national championship. So it seemed pretty significant to me. Yeah. And surprisingly, with transfers included, Florida State actually has more than Georgia did last year and more than anyone on their schedule. Projected 10 wins, like we talked about. They're favored in 9 of 12 games. It should be 10. The Florida game is laughable to me for them. And Phil Steele, his experience rank, that's what this stat is. He combines where you're looking at upperclassmen, lettermen, tackles, yardage, all that's returning. He thinks Florida State's returning experience is the second most valuable in the country. You can see the offensive numbers here. Now, of course, we know there are the clock change rules, so the numbers may look different this year. It may not grow a lot. We don't know how much time that's going to shave off a game. We'll find out a lot in the first week. So yards per play, Florida State last year, almost 7 yards per play, 7th in the country. Scoring offense, 36.1. That's supposed to be points per game at 16th. Success rate was top 20. Red zone, they got to get a little bit better. We know that a lot had to do with kicking issues, but they were over 90% in 2021. So we know they have the ability. One of the most explosive offenses in the country, 97 plays of 20-plus yards, 3rd in the country. The teams above them played 1 and 2 additional games, so they probably would have led had they had a similar sample set. Total defense, top 14 in yards per play, top 20 in scoring defense. A little bit down in the success rate, but we know Adam Fuller kind of does that bend, don't break type of defense. Yep. And then the red zone, again, clean that up a little bit. They did good at limiting explosive plays. So that just kind of sets a little bit of what Florida State's working with this year. And the offense, a lot of people go, well, how do they get better if they were already good last year? And I think it comes to experience and additions through the portal. A lot of people don't realize that last year was a lot of their impact players' first really legitimate experience. I mean, Jordan Travis's first year's QB1. Trey Benson he had 6 carries for 22 yards before last year and almost was a 1,000-yard rusher. Johnny Wilson, I think he had like 230 something receiving yards. Now you've added Keon Coleman. You've added depth in the trenches. You've flipped your tight end room. You have some of the best, couple of the best tight ends in the country, and all that. So to me, the offense really has the potential to be a top 5 offense. I think they can really carry the defense if they have to. But I think the defense, a lot of people don't think they were as good as it says on paper last year because they didn't play a ton of tough offenses. But I really think if you think about the Big 12 teams of the past, Florida State if you can win a shootout, you only need your defense to be good enough. And so just kind of share some of your thoughts on what it is about Florida State's offense in 2023 that you think can put them at that help them take that next step from already a top 15, top 10 offense that we saw in 2022.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's basically the progression of Jordan Travis at this point. He's 5th overall in the Heisman odds at this point with FanDuel, DraftKings, other places like that. But really, when you're looking at everything, and I understand people want to put that much investment in Jordan Travis winning a Heisman at that point, I definitely think Florida State loves to be able to establish the run early and often at that point. So Trey Benson is going to be your guy there that's going to be able to eclipse hopefully 1,000 yards at that point. You have Keziah Holmes that's also going to be a viable weapon from Penn State they weren't able to use last season. Lawrence Toafili in the slot as well as in the backfield also. Rodney Hill, for example, I know he's battling some injuries right now and he's having to go through that process so far. But I mean, that's 4 running backs. Plus, you didn't even really mention with the CJ Campbell aspect, what is he going to be able to utilize in the offense? You have so many running backs in the system that while you talk about Johnny Wilson and Keon Coleman and a sneaky guy, Destin Hill, who I think is going to be a very valuable part in this offense as well, when you look at that, Florida State loves to run the football. You have 8 offensive linemen, possibly 9 or 10, that can be able to be utilized in this scheme, and they want to be able to utilize guys like that. You have Marquise and Douglas and also Kyle Morlock with Jaheim Bell, and I think there's a lot of factors that go into it that really, when you look at it, if Florida State's able to run the ball effectively, I think this offense can be at a different level, not simply for running the time down the clock and making sure that, with this running clock situation, it's going to be that type of situation. But the offensive numbers could be able to elevate up to 40 points per game, not simply because of Jordan Travis's play, but just the offensive around him, like you said before. I think it's very special to kind of see because not only are you thinking about this offense being explosive, but now they're being kind of lethal and they're going to say, okay, well, if you're going to stop us on first down passing the ball, we're just going to run it down your throat for 8 yards a carry. I mean, that's kind of the way I look at it with this offense being so versatile. And I'm going to follow a question up to you as well, because when you look at Jordan Travis and his progression as a passer, we talk about his confidence level. And Coach Dillingham was that type of person that said, okay, Jordan, you are a quarterback. You're not a running back. You're not a receiver. You are who you are, Jordan. Do you think that confidence level that brought him from Coach Dillingham and Mike Norvell at that point, do you think that really affected him to be the quarterback that he is today? And do you think he can elevate that game for where he was last season to another level this season?
I do. And I think that really that's why I think it's so important that people understand that last year was his first year as the sole quarterback one. There's no more I got to make this happen or I'm getting yanked for this guy or that guy. And, I actually was fortunate enough to attend ACC Media Days. And my question for Jordan Travis was, how do you feel that the experience you gained going into the Superdome and beating LSU, winning these big games and things like that, how do you feel that's going to help you prepare going forward, knowing all the expectations that are on you? The very first thing he said was the NC State game and how it changed him and matured him as a quarterback. And he knows that everybody focuses, everybody celebrates the stats and the Heisman talk and this, that, and the other. But it's the failures that you normally learn the most from in life. Those are the things that you focus on in the offseason. It's what can I do better? And I think that this team embodies what Jordan Travis thinks mentally, as in, yeah, 10 wins is great, but that's not what we play for. And I think Jordan Travis, he's of course he's going to say, I don't care about the Heisman. He wants to win. He wants to win championships. He wants to be a good teammate. And I think that it's just, you hear a lot of the camp reports coming out now where Jordan is able to, it's rare that he makes a mistake. And when he does, you almost don't even have to say anything to him because he's going to coach himself up. He's harder on himself than any coach can be. And I think that is so key to having the leader of the team, the leader of the offense, be that guy that holds himself to that standard. And I think he is going to be able to elevate his game even further this year because one, you have a solid run game to lean on. He doesn't have to throw the ball, but I mean, this offense has to literally be a defensive coordinator's nightmare. Like, you were going to double Johnny Wilson and leave Keon Coleman open? Congratulations, that's 6. You're going to, back off and play the pass? Okay, good luck. You got Trey Benson, or you have Jordan Travis, who we know is a quarterback, but is better than most running backs sitting back there. And that's one thing I think about Jordan really took off last year too, was everybody knew about his running ability. Everybody knew that, but it was the passing ability that we needed to see take flight. And it really did. He was, top 5 per PFF, led the ACC in yards per play, yards per completion, and passing efficiency. So his arm took off while at the same time, he was still an effective and almost more efficient runner. When you look at, he had 8 less sacks last year than before, despite having 120 more dropbacks. So, he really does have that element of his game that I think is being elevated by the maturity that he has now. And I think Florida State is going to benefit greatly from that. And you give him so many weapons to work with that I really do think Jordan is going to have a stellar season. Now, like you said, with the running game and things like that, is he going to win the Heisman? That's hard to say when you have guys like Caleb Williams that are going to throw for 4,000 and things like that. That may not be the case. But I think you have a quarterback who's good enough, and I've said this as an example before. I mean, Georgia won with a walk-on at quarterback. You have a guy who is good enough to win you every game on your schedule. And I think this year, the offense is, even if Tate comes in, even if a backup comes in, they're going to benefit from those better weapons, from the receivers that they have. But I really think Florida State reaching their goals this year starts and ends with Jordan Travis having the type of season that we know he can, that we expect from him. And I'm excited to see it. I really am excited to see him now with another year. If you think about it experience-wise, he's really kind of like a sophomore or a junior because he just hasn't played a lot. And, there's only things you can gain by being on the field and gaining the experience.
Yeah, I was super excited because, Jordan, as you said before, he's dealt with a lot of adversity while at Florida State. A lot of fans, when they first saw him in live action, can he be able to throw the football 15 yards downfield? I mean, it was a serious question at that point. And
Yeah.
we have come such a long way in that factor. And yes, there have been mistakes along the way. And I can't say this coaching staff was perfect in regards to keeping Jordan Travis engaged. And there was a lot of times where he could have went down the wrong path. For example, Mackenzie Milton, in the Notre Dame game. And then he was able to come out against Jacksonville State. Kind of saw what happened with that, with the limited mobility that Jordan Travis had with that injury. There was a couple of different factors there where they brought in a couple of quarterbacks to try to, not really ruin his development, but they just didn't think that Jordan Travis is where he was at that point. And it's okay to understand that. And I think Jordan kind of looked himself in the mirror and said, okay, this is where I'm at as a quarterback. How can I be able to improve myself to get better? And I think that's one thing that you can always congratulate Jordan Travis on is his confidence in his ability to be able to be successful regardless of what the outcomes and adversities in life come. And that's where Coach Norvell talks about response. That's a huge response by him being able to kind of navigate through all the noise and do what's best for yourself.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, with a guy like Jordan, who's a very experienced player in his final year, he's like a coach on the field. And that's something that he can help and he can help get a lot of these other guys on the same page and things like that. And that's invaluable in big game experiences to not have to rely. I mean, I think one thing that gets overshadowed a lot, or overlooked, should I say, is Florida State has not really blown anybody out or pulled away from even FCS teams in the past few years. So they've struggled to be able to get the young guys these reps and games and blowouts to get that experience. And I think that that's something that like Jordan Travis really didn't get a lot of. Sometimes he got thrown, like you said, he gets thrown into unfair situations
Mhm.
and is expected to work miracles. And I think now this year you're going to see that going forward with guys like Brock Glenn and like AJ Duffy, where they're going to get a lot of game experience by Florida State. Let's face it, blowing out a good bit. I mean, I personally think they should win, 5 or 6 games on the schedule by double digits easily.
Yeah.
And so I do want to touch on one thing. I think it's funny that you mentioned this.
Mhm.
You said that you think Florida State could average around 40 points a game. Now I did a little math in here in
Mhm.
the preseason magazine, and I did something that what I kind of came up with some weird math. It doesn't
Mhm.
make sense, but it works in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
end. So points above replacement. When you look at the guys you're bringing in versus the guys that are going out, and this is not a dish on Pokey Wilson or Micah
Mhm.
Pittman or Cam McDonald. It's not a dish on them. They did the best they could while they were here. But when you look at adding in 3 guys, Keon Coleman, Winston Wright, if he's healthy up to 2021 standards, and Jaheim Bell, if you added in what they produced points per game wise to what Florida State did last year, it would have put them at 41.4 points per game, which would have been tied for USC in third in scoring offense. And they would have averaged around 551 yards per game, which would have led the country. So when you look at the additional experience and the pieces that they brought in, something that we've talked about before is Norvell couldn't really run an offense that's built for playmakers without
Yeah.
playmakers. And so now that you continuously elevate that talent level, you're starting to see the offense that we expected from Mike Norvell. And I think that that is something that, you just about nailed it. And when you look at the time that's going to run off the clock with the
Yeah.
running clock thing, it should be around 40 points per game. I think Phil Steele has him at 38.1
Yeah.
points per game projected. So that's a really good number. And I do think, like you said, when you look at a lot of the things that Florida State has elevated at the really they've gotten better at every position group. I mean,
Yeah.
if we're being honest, through experience, through attrition, through bringing in, they brought in over 1,700 yards from the portal, and so I do think the offense has that ability to score 40 points a game. Now, using that, and like you said, they like to rush. They ran the ball over 200 yards 8 times last year. And I think that's a huge part of having Alex Atkins as your offensive coordinator, who's able to tailor that offense to the strengths of the O line. And I think that paid huge dividends. And so I think, like you said, you have a CJ Campbell's guy I'm really excited about. They just put that video out this
Yeah.
morning of him making a play in practice. And the first thing I retweeted was like, man, this guy's got something to him, the way he runs the ball. So I think you're going to see so many, the crazy thing about this offense, they said in throughout camp that Deuce Spann was clocked GPS wise as the fastest player on the offense, on the team, and he's like 6'4", 206,
Mhm.
and gets completely overlooked. You're talking about a freak athlete that isn't even mentioned in the maybe even 3 deep. I think Destin Hill is a guy you named.
Yeah.
That's not a true freshman. He might be
Yeah.
in the sense of what's next to his name on a roster sheet,
Mhm.
but physical maturity wise, he's pretty much a sophomore or redshirt sophomore or whatever. So
Mhm.
he's going to be a guy that I expect to make some plays. So before we wrap up the offense and kind of move into defense,
Mhm.
just kind of give me a couple of guys that you're really watching to kind of have a breakout season in 2023. Maybe not guys that like
Yeah.
we already know,
Mhm.
everybody's going to say Keon and all them,
Yeah.
but who are some guys you expect to kind of come out of nowhere and really be solid contributors this year?
So honestly, I actually think that Deuce Spann is going to be one of those guys that kind of steps up. This was kind of a surprise aspect last year because we saw him early on in the LSU game, and progressively, he kind of got out of the rotation because he's still trying to figure things out. This is a former quarterback from
Right.
Illinois at this point. This is not a guy that was a polished receiver coming out of high school and everything like that. He was only a 3-star prospect, very lowly regarded at that point. Decided to go to Illinois instead of sticking it back at home. I think was very important. And you saw the moment that him and Mike Norvell had after kind of a unfortunate
Yeah.
penalty that he got a little bit upset over, and that's a growing process for him. And I think it's very important. Fans were super excited about him being on kickoff returns because of his speed, because of everything else. Just didn't really pan out the way he thought it would. But I think now that you look yourself in the mirror a little bit, you understand what you are as a player. you can kind of grow and develop yourself off of that. And I think he can be utilized in the slot, considering you have a Winston Wright Jr., for example, that's still kind of navigating the mental hurdle of suffering that horrific injury that he had in the car accident. What would kind of that factors be with him? Ja'Kai Douglas battled the injuries last year in the slot. Will he kind of get over that mental hurdle of, okay, I am gonna get back to myself again. I'm gonna be making wheel routes against Miami again
Yep.
on those huge plays. I think it's kind of important because that receiver position, why you're talking about it being so stacked, those are some of the guys that you can kind of look at on the receiver side of the ball that aren't really getting talked about a lot. You can go to the offensive line, for example. Everybody knows that Florida State has about 8 guys that are going to be pretty effective. And I think probably the best offensive lineman out of this rotation would probably be Jeremiah Byers. I definitely think that was a huge pickup for Mike Norvell and this staff in terms of that. But just a guy that you're going to have in a glue type of situation that's going to be your guy that if Maurice Smith gets hurt, what happens? Everybody was worried about the center position. What are they going to do? Darius Washington will be that type of guy that'll come in, start right away at the center, guard, or tackle position. They have him playing everywhere at this point. I think he is very, very, very beneficial to what Florida State brings to the table in terms of offensive line depth, because I think without him, you might be a little stuck. They've tried to do Roddick at center. They've tried to do Byers at center. They tried Quayshawn Sapp. They've tried a lot of guys, and it really hasn't panned out the way they thought it would. So a lot of times when you're looking at rotational pieces, I definitely think Darius Washington is probably one of the most important factors on the offensive line that not a lot of people are talking about, and they definitely need to start speaking about it now.
Yeah, he's really kind of been that Swiss Army knife for this team. I mean, he's played just about every position. I think Maurice Smith is definitely an underrated guy when you talk about just a must-have staple on your offensive
Yeah,
line. I love the pick at wide receiver. I mean, look at Darian Williamson. That's another
yeah,
guy. I mean, he only came in versus Boston College and had a 98-yard game, has like a 90-yard reception rate, and then he got injured, so he didn't really come back until later in this. I think he played in the bowl game, but
yeah.
like don't just a complete afterthought. And I mean, you just have guys down the way. I think Keziah Holmes is a guy that I'm excited about. Scout team player of the year at Penn State, 2 years being developed in the Big Ten. This offense just has so many weapons. I'm just really excited to see it in action this year. And I know Mike Norvell just has to be like a kid in a candy store when you see all these weapons that you have to choose from.
I will say this too, and I know we talked about the tight end position a little bit earlier about the 3 guys that we have there, and you know that Jaheim Bell is probably going to be your tight end number 1 at this point. He's a bona fide playmaker at the position, but it kind of becomes a little bit more interesting because people start talking about Kyle Morlock coming in over the transfer portal, and everybody kind of forgets about Marquise Douglas, and it just seems like he come along later in the season, so a lot of people were kind of understood of what he was, but I don't think they quite understood his impact and what it takes to kind of be a tight end at the next level. Everyone was talking about the weight change, and he was up to 289 pounds. He was working with the offensive line a little bit. Everybody was calling him Biscuit, still calling him Biscuit, but just one of those pieces that is kind of forgotten by this fan base. And a couple years ago, if I told you about the tight end room, they were like, "What tight ends?" you know? And
Yep.
it was just like, oh, well, we don't really have that great of tight ends. We're just trying to figure out everything. And Cam McDonald did a tremendous job when he was at Florida State. I think he did what he served his purpose for, just like you talked about with Pokey Wilson and everything else. But I definitely think with that tight end number 2 spot that you're definitely going to have to figure out what's valuable the most in certain situations. Maybe he's utilized more in goal line packages. Maybe it's more third down. Maybe, we might even see a little bit more in the slot with some of those guys as well. I think it's very important to understand that because the tight end position for Mike Norvell has been known as one of those positions that he kind of monitors as we go through. It's his baby at that point.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that because I think Morlock obviously, gives you another 6'7"
Mhm.
target in the red zone. And I think Biscuit is really Marquise Douglas is a really he's an overlooked player,
Yeah.
underappreciated at times because with the size, first off, I'll say he does things that somebody with that size shouldn't be able to do when you see some of the catches and stuff that he makes. And he really came on late last year, like you said. The one question I had about this group was, can they have a good blocking tight end? And you don't expect that from Jaheim Bell, but that's not why you brought him here. Kyle Morlock, I think when he came in, he was like 6'7", 250. So maybe he needed a little more mass. I think Marqueston Douglas is going to be your main blocking tight end because he has the size to do it. So I think that is going to be crucial. And, even a guy like Preston Daniels, someone that is a walk-on, everybody remembers the play against North Carolina years back where Norvell had everybody going this way. And then Preston Daniels just over there doing jumping jacks in the field by himself. And that's the thing that's so exciting to me about this offense is Mike Norvell knows how to get people open. Destin Hill hasn't caught a pass in college yet. We're super excited about it. You talk about when we talked about with Deuce Spann, former quarterback, still learning, but he'll find ways to get them the ball, jet sweeps, things like that. He'll put them in different positions to be able to get these playmakers the ball. So I definitely agree that tight end is going to be something. It's almost a new fold in the offense that we really haven't seen before. So it's almost like you added a whole nother position group to the offense that you almost kind of didn't get much from the past few years. And I think that's just going to continue to put the offense over top. So just so we don't run too entirely long here, we'll go ahead and kind of push towards the defense and some thoughts there. Now, I do want to say that a lot of people, when we circle back to what I said about like playing like Big 12 ball, where you just got to outscore the other team. That's all that really matters. And one important thing that I want to bring up, because here's the thing, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, all these teams are looming out there. They're not on your schedule. You don't concern yourself with them until that bridge appears. The teams on your schedule, I think Florida State should have a pretty successful year on defense. And I'm going to pop up this thing here. So this is the points per game versus FBS teams. This filters out FCS, which kind of jacks things up a little bit. So when you look at the points per game by the teams on your schedule, Florida State against against FBS only opponents last year averaged 35.2 points per game. Only one team, and that's Wake Forest, and I expect them to take a very large step back, losing Sam Hartman and A.T. Perry. I mean, as long as your defense, if we think Florida State can average close to 40 points a game, of course, these teams can get better. I think Clemson has a chance to get better with better quarterback play and a better offensive coordinator. Duke can get better. They're still kind of lagging in talent, things like that. So some of these teams can get better, but you're talking about Florida lost their quarterback, Pitt change at quarterback. LSU, their offense is kind of up and down sometimes. Cuse lost their All-American running back. And so you look at all these teams, like you're telling me Florida State's defense can't hold some of these teams that are averaging 15, 18, 20 points a game. Like, I think the thing is you don't need a 2021 Georgia defense. You just need enough. You need enough. And I think you can get it from this defense with the teams that are on your schedule. Okay, you got Clemson. That's kind of tough. But I want to say Florida State only has 2 offenses in the top 30 from last year that they faced this year. So it's not like you have North Carolina on the schedule or anything like that. But as a whole, I think this defense has enough to get it done. And before we kind of talk into some of the personnel things, just kind of give me your thoughts as a whole on the defense in 2023, and do they have enough to get it done while keeping in mind you have that high-powered offense?
Yeah, I definitely do. And I know a lot of people criticize Adam Fuller, and there's a tough crowd out there for Adam Fuller. I am definitely a believer in Adam Fuller. I definitely think that he is the right man for the job in terms of the defense coordinator. I think Florida State does a really nice job, specifically on the defensive line. I think it's very important. Well, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but Jared Verse is a tremendous, tremendous player that came back for another season at Florida State. Fabian Lovett, another example. I mean, there are so many different pieces on this defensive line, and I think it starts there at that point. Can Florida State be able to kind of generate those turnovers to be able to kind of get the ball back to their offense? I think you can definitely do that with some of the playmakers you have in the secondary. And when you're looking at everything else, I mean, you have a Clemson that you're having to play. You're having an LSU. You're having a Miami that should be a better team from last season. There's a couple of different teams on there that I think can cause you a little bit of issues. Maybe if Leonard does a really nice job at Duke, we'll kind of see how that factors in when they play Clemson. But just overall, I think Florida State's defense can be very, very optimistic in what they bring back from the table. I mean, this isn't a team that, is losing a lot of pieces on the defense side of the ball. think it's very important that you understand that, because when you look at it and go across the country, there's a lot of teams that are losing that starting production. And we're over here like, okay, well, we've got our defensive line set. Really, anything else is just gravy on top at this point. And I think Florida State's kind of in a great position to be able to kind of generate enough momentum for their offense. And I think that's something that you can kind of really hang your hat on with this season.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. And the thing is, like, normally when I do preseason previews and things
Mhm.
like that, of course, you got a good idea in your mind what Florida State has, but then I go look at everybody else.
Mhm.
And when you start running down the line, I mean, these losses just add up team by team by team.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, outside of, someone actually pointed something out the other day that I really didn't think a whole lot about, but it is
Mhm.
interesting. Florida State played 6 teams last year that was in year 1 of a new staff. So
Yeah.
there's the potential for a lot of teams to get better. But you also look at there's a lot of teams that lost a lot of really high-end guys. So there's a lot of teams I don't expect to get better. And, I will say, like, Adam Fuller, no matter what your opinion on him is, when you listen to him talk, like, Adam Fuller, football dude. Like,
Yeah.
he loves the game. He's very intelligent when you talk to him. I think he understands it. I think it just, again, it's like we talked about with Mike Norvell and the offense. You got to get those high end pieces.
Yeah.
Football is slated towards offense nowadays anyway, with the way things get called and things like that. I think that the defense, you're not going to see teams get 4 shutouts a year. You're not going to see
Yeah.
hold elite offenses down like, say, Georgia in 2021 did, or something like that. But yeah, I think this defense can do enough when you look at the pieces they bring back. Had you got Jamie Robinson back,
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
like
I,
I'm booking my ticket to Houston this year. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I'd been ready for it, but it is what it is. But looking at the defensive line, and we'll kind of go through some of the personnel. I do like, you look at the areas where they struggled last year, where they need to get better. Run defense up the middle. We know how much Fabian Lovett being out hurt, and David Hale put out a stat where it said, with Fabian Lovett, Florida State's defense last year allowed an average of 3.37 yards per play and had a sack rate of 11.5%. Without Fabian Lovett, those numbers went to 5.27 yards per play and a sack rate of 9.9. I mean, there's a reason. I think that the blue chip ratio, it was something I talked about in the magazine. A lot of it depends on where your blue chips are at, and the trenches are crucial to have those players in. So you lose your most dominant defensive tackle at the beginning of the season, and you have Josh Farmer play more snaps than Fabian Lovett does as a freshman. So now you look at coming into 2023, you have Jared Verse, who, oh, by the way, it was only his first year playing Power 5
Mhm.
or even FBS football. Like, that's a whole nother year of experience. That's a whole nother year of development. You look at Patrick Payton. He's only the freshman defensive rookie of the year in the ACC. He's continued to develop, put on weight, worked on his run defense. That's going to be another guy. You bring in Gilbert Edmond from South Carolina, guy that's got a ton of experience in the SEC, led the Gamecocks in tackles for loss. So you got 3 defensive ends you feel good about. Now your depth is a little thin there. You're going to look at Byron Turner Jr. Hasn't played a whole lot, but is a good guy. He has the potential to make an impact. Then you look at defensive line. The interior group is one of the position groups I'm most excited about. Now, of course, we have to put that asterisk on there. Daryl Jackson's waiver got denied. That's a big hurt to your depth. 6'6", 300 pounds with a couple years of
Mhm.
experience. That's hard to replace. I mean, it is what it is. Now, I will say North Carolina's hopeful they're going to get their guys' waiver overturned. I don't know. I mean, we're up against the clock right now. I know he can still practice, so it's kind of like just flipping the go switch.
Yeah.
But that hurts your depth. But I think the guy I might be the most excited about this year is Braden Fisk. He was
Yeah.
super productive at Western Michigan. And it just he's like Biscuit, he does things a guy with that size shouldn't be able to do. And so looking at this group, now you have Malcolm Ray, completely forgot about guy who has a lot of experience. Josh Farmer now has all that experience. Dennis Briggs, coming off an injury, has been a really productive player throughout his career when he's healthy. And so just kind of, touching on the defensive line, give me some of your thoughts on that group.
Yeah, and you kind of said it in your last point. Dennis Briggs, I think, is going to make a really huge impact. He's going to have to. I mean, this is his kind of coming out party at that point. He had that horrific injury, season-ending injury against Louisville, and you really didn't know what to expect from him because he has been defensive tackle to defensive end, back to defensive tackle. I mean, he's been around the defense for quite some time, and when you're looking at kind of that defensive line room, as we talked about with Jackson's waiver not being denied as of right now, I would not rule out an in-season reinstatement for that, but we'll definitely see as we go through. But just overall, I think the defensive line, Odell Higgins has got to be smiling from ear to ear at this point.
Hmm.
I mean, this is the best defensive line that he's had at Florida State in quite some time, even without Jackson being kind of in the lineup. I mean, when you look at it, I mean, Tiafasi, for example, I think is a guy that they brought in, super excited. And I mean, with his kind of a red shirt year, his academic red shirt that he had to take, and he's kind of developing his skill set as we go through with the collegiate game. Man, he's special.
That's a
And
grown man for a redshirt
yeah,
freshman. Grown man. That is a big dude.
and I mean, there's a lot of guys on this defense. I mean, Daniel Lyons can probably be a factor if we go through here. I mean, there's a couple of guys there, but you touched on it before. I mean, with Joshua Farmer, with his experience that he had last season, wasn't great experience. He was probably overwhelmed a couple of times in run support and didn't really have the proper techniques that he should have had. But now, when you've got through a year, he's developed his skill set a little bit more. He's kind of coming into his own. I think is very important. You need that confidence as you go through. And sure, his best friend Jackson isn't being able to play as of right now, and that's partially the reason why you stuck at Florida State. That is a little bit discouraging. But now he can kind of take his game to the next level. Maybe have a couple of NFL scouts kind of look and monitor your game, and we'll kind of see where that goes. But I definitely think this defensive line, as you talked about with Braden Fisk, I think him and Fabian Lovett are going to be your top two starting defensive tackles. And then you're going to have some depth coming through that defensive tackle room. And I definitely think Joshua Farmer is going to be a pivotal piece because you're not going to have, Lovett playing 60 snaps a game or anything to that
No.
nature. I definitely think you're going to have some depth at that position. And Odell Higgins has definitely got his work cut out for him in terms of finding those next options as we go through past those three.
Yeah, and I do think the defensive line, at defensive end, I think you're pretty solid and you're too deep.
Yeah.
I think the interior group, you got about 3 waves of guys you can bring in
Yeah.
that can be effective. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of drop off from Fisk and Lovett, who I think are going to be the starters too. But
Yeah.
you're not bringing in true freshmen anymore. You're bringing in guys who have
Mhm.
experience, who've had a few years to transform their bodies and get strength and conditioning and all that stuff. So I do think it's going to be huge. And when you look at that was their biggest weakness last year. Now they've corrected that. And so that should really help their defense a lot this year. I think it's going to help everybody behind them now that you're playing against or behind a more dominant defensive line. And I mean, Clemson's still loaded. Let's not beat around the bush on defensive line. They're still loaded. But I think Florida State's probably number 2 in the ACC, probably top 10 in the country as far as defensive line goes, as far as your ones. And even then, your depth is really talented. And I think, I often talk about, like, of course, Florida State has big games against Clemson and LSU.
Mhm.
I really think there's about 6 games on the season on the schedule. I mean, you could leave Fabian on the bus and you
Yeah.
could still probably win those games. But I think the benefit to that is not only will that get other players experience, but now you keep those guys fresh. Now Fabian doesn't have to play, but 20, 30 snaps a game or something like that. He doesn't need that much of a workload to make an impact and then get somebody else in. Maybe you give him a lot of second halves off to keep these guys healthy for throughout the course of the season, because it's a long season and you got to keep these guys healthy, because like we talked about, Florida State just doesn't have a ton of depth. Now in some positions they do, which is the defensive line. One position they don't, that we'll go to next, is linebacker. Now I maybe feel a little better about linebacker than a lot of other people do. I
Yeah.
think this group is better than people give them credit for. Are they
Mhm.
perfect? No. Am I putting them all on the Buckus Award list? No. But I think that Tatum Bethune, we know he dealt with some injuries last year. He's a little bit banged up. He was a 100+ tackler at UCF. He's a veteran presence in the middle of your defense. I think you got Kalen DeLoach, who's an exceptional athlete. Sometimes on the field, like, he looks like the best player on the field. He looks like a missile shot out of a cannon when he's going after a quarterback. He's great for spying guys like Daniels against LSU. Sometimes he has some moments where you're like, all right, what are we doing?
Yeah.
But overall, I think just that again, he's a guy that benefited from another full year of being a starter last year. DJ Lundy is a guy, and we know they play a lot of 2-backer sets, so you can get away with some thin depth there. DJ Lundy is a guy who had a really good season. When you look at all of his metrics, all of his stats last year on a per snap basis, because he played a little bit less last year, it all went up. So he's getting better. I think if you can get Omar Graham Jr., he's a player who has a high upside, just not a lot of experience. If you can get him up to speed. Blake Nicholson already had a takeaway in practice. Like, you have some guys to work with. You also get Cryer from Northwestern. I think you have enough, because linebacker, the way they play football nowadays, if you had to pick a position that you were okay with being average at, it's probably linebacker, to be honest. You'd rather have a dominant defensive line in secondary. So just give me some quick thoughts on the linebackers and how you see this group performing in 2023.
So, I mean, you have Deloach, you have Bethune, you have your two starters at linebacker. You know what they are. But I will say that I would not discount DJ Lundy. I think it's going to be a coming out party for him, and he's going to have to step up because he's going to be your main sole guy next season as a redshirt senior. I think that's very important because early on in his career at Florida State, he was more of a run stopper. He was about 255 pounds at that point. Now he's down to about 238. It's a little bit easier, a little bit more manageable in terms of the weight at this point. You got a guy like Brian Courtney, who you just converted over from tight end, that loaded tight end room that we talked about, to now linebacker room that's a little bit more suspect because you have Brendan Gant go over to Colorado and everything else. So you're having to replace Brendan Gant, which is kind of disappointing a little bit. You'd wish that Brendan Gant would have stayed, so that way you didn't have to rely on an Omar Graham Jr. so early on in his career. But fans and also spectators of the practice so far have saw that Omar Graham has done a really nice job so far in his development. Granted, he's probably not going to play a ton. Justin Cryer is another guy, 6'2", 230 pounds. I think can be a really effective guy, especially in a run-stopping situation that can be there. But, I mean, overall, you have guys that can be successful. I think you have talent there like DeMarco Ward and also Blake Nicholson. Dylan Brown Turner is another guy who I think can be effective on special teams this season if he kind of puts his mind to it. But overall, this linebacker room's solid. But can they be able to elevate their game to a next level? I think that's very important to understand there.
Right, and I definitely agree. When I said in my position preview was they're not littered with NFL draft picks, but
Yeah.
they have a lot of really good college football players.
Mhm.
They don't really have a weakness. It's just not maybe an overwhelming strength. So I
Mhm.
think they're going to get what they need to out of this group if the top guys can stay healthy. I do agree about DJ Lundy. The guy's just a physical specimen. I
Yeah.
mean, if you could chisel a linebacker out of stone, DJ Lundy's that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
And then going to the secondary, I think
Mhm.
the secondary, obviously you lose Jamie Robinson. That's a big loss. It hurts. But I think there's a lot of guys to be excited about. Obviously, you get the number one rated corner in the portal at the time, Fentrell Cypress. I know people said he got off to a slow start in spring
Yeah.
camp and things like that. It is what it is, man. When I look at stats and when the lights are on Saturdays, I think there was like a 4-game stretch of ACC opponents, and I believe he allowed like one catch for 6 yards in like 4 games. That's what matters to me. It's going to be an acclimation period, but then you also bring in guys like you have Azarie Thomas. You bring him into the
Mhm.
conversation. He was a young guy last year. We saw him make some mistakes, gave up some touchdowns and some miscommunications, trial by fire.
Yep.
That's a guy who could be the next great DB at Florida State. Like when you watch him on the field, he just moves different. Renardo Green had a breakout season last year. Jerryon Jones, Greedy Vance is another guy that, I love his aggressive style. It might be a little too much at times, but I
Yeah.
love the aggressiveness. I think they have a lot of talent at DB. I'm hoping that they can get more out of that group this year with Patrick Surtain. I'd like to see the interceptions go up. They kind of lacked on those last year. Sometimes they didn't really get their head around and play the ball too well.
Mhm.
I think that that's something that the coaching, and that's not against Marcus Woodson. I know he's doing the best he can, but I think Surtain, a guy who's been a high level DB in the NFL himself, I think you're going to see an elevation of play from that group just by the coaching. You got Akeem Dent on the back end who is very experienced, kind of got overshadowed by Jamie Robinson a lot. Shaheem Brown is a guy I'm high on. I think
Yeah.
Shaheem Brown is going to shock some people this year. I think he's a better player than I give him credit for. You got young talent behind the safety. It's not very deep, but you like the guys, Conrad Hussey and guys like that. You really like those guys if they have to step in. And of course, you got Southern Miss. You should be able to get them some playing time
Yeah.
there. Boston College, you should be able to get them some playing time early, some of these guys. But I think the secondary is going to be good enough under some new coaching behind a much better defensive line to give Florida State what they need this year. So share your thoughts on the secondary.
Yeah, so you talked about Greedy Vance with being kind of an aggressive specimen sometimes. They're going to probably put him at nickel this season, and he's going to be very good. I'll say that. And I definitely think in the safety room, everybody talks about depth and And man, we're thin. We have freshmen coming left and right. But one name you have to remember is Kevin Knowles
Yep.
switching over to the safety position. That is a guy you have to watch out for. I definitely think he is going to adjust himself nicely to the defense, and you're going to see him a lot this season in terms of just production, what he brings to the table. I think there's a lot that you can kind of hang your hat on with Kevin Knowles because he has so much experience. And I think he's kind of found that rejuvenation of himself. And I think it can definitely be special. Shaheem Brown, like I said before, and like you were talking about, very underrated kid. Super excited about his development as he kind of progresses into that starting role this season. And Jerrion Jones, for example, I think he's a veteran that you definitely need, along with Renardo Green. I think can definitely be two guys that you have there. Ventrell Cypress struggling a little bit as we've gone through adjusting from college to college. It happens, but he'll get there eventually. I definitely think this safety and cornerback room as we go through it, Patrick Surtain, I think can definitely be a special room. He talks about and emphasizes the factors of forcing takeaways. I think it's very important there as well. Florida State only had 7 interceptions they generated last season. Definitely expect that number to go over past 10. And I definitely think that Florida State can be able to generate a lot of momentum as we go through some of these blowouts and forcing a lot of turnovers this season. I'm super excited to see where that secondary goes.
Definitely. And, when you look at it, they really don't have a lot of tough passing offenses. I think
Yeah.
Clemson's probably going to be your toughest with Klubnik. But I think, he's still young. He's still inexperienced. And I do think the defense is going to be good enough this year. No, before we go kind of rapid fire, because I think we just passed an hour into a little bit of schedule talk. Special teams. So I've heard so far that it's still kind of a hit or miss, but I like that you have some competition between the kickers. Fitzgerald kind of rebounded last year towards the end of the year. I actually got a chance to talk with Ricky Aguayo on another podcast, and he talked about how he had a 3-step approach, went to 2-step because it's more of an NFL thing. And towards the end of the year, he switched back to the 3-step approach, found some success. I still think Florida State is going to come into the red zone with a mindset of, let's get 6 and we'll go for 3 if we have to. They're not going to just up and kick because you don't have that guaranteed, money kicker. But I do think that's the last thing to touch on. I think special teams outside of kicking, though, has really improved last year under Mike Norvell. They were terrible a few years ago, and Mike Norvell has had great special teams throughout his career. And I think that is another aspect of the game. We're talking about Keon Coleman returning punts is what some people are saying. And I know it makes people nervous when you hear about him and Trey Benson returning kicks, but when you're Florida State and you are, let's just say, outmanned in a few games, you got to find that edge any way you can. And to have that playmaker who can possibly break one, but frankly, just know when to catch it, secure the ball, and get it to this offense. Just kind of give me a few thoughts quickly on the special teams and what your outlook for that is.
Yeah, I am a Ryan Fitzgerald truther at this point. 8 for 11 his last 11 kicks. So after the NC State game, had a moment of himself, and I think you understood what that meant to him in terms of technique-wise and just confidence level. I think is very important. Keltner's going to put up a good fight. I will say that's going to be a great competition as we go through. Special teams, as Mike Norvell talked about, is the foundation and the culture of your program. In the initial press conference that he had, I definitely think that he wants to emphasize that as we go through, because some of those special teams plays, as you talked about, it can be 1 or 2 plays that win the ball game, and you have to be able to perform effectively on special teams. And all good programs that we have mostly have good special teams as we go through.
Definitely. I mean, block kicks is becoming our thing. The block at the Rock, the block on the Bayou. Like, we have all these different block kicks that are huge. And that's something that could, it could be the difference between, winning a game or a loss. And so I do think that is something that they pay a lot of attention to. They put a lot of time in it. And I think that it's going to continue to be elevated this year, and it's going to help have that third phase. So lastly, now that we've kind of talked about both sides of the ball, what we're excited about, what we think is going to, Florida State's bringing into 2023, let's just kind of 2-minute offense into the schedule now. Let's go. First up, you got LSU. A lot of people talk about Florida State being overrated. Man, I think LSU might be a smidge overrated. Like, just from the 1,000-foot look, the preview, Jaden Daniels, he's experienced quarterback, great scrambler, jury's still out on passing. He had a couple games he didn't even throw for 100 yards last year. Then you look at the offensive line. It should not be weakness this year. They should be a lot better. Running backs, they bring in Logan Diggs from Notre Dame, who might be a guy for them. He had over 800 all-purpose yards last year. But other than that, they really haven't had any dominant running backs. Jaden Daniels led in rushing last year. Receiving group, you have Neighbors, who is a 1,000-yard receiver, Mason Taylor. Other than that, they lost a lot of guys last year, and we did a really good job of controlling the pass game for most of the game last year. Defense, everybody thinks they've got this just amazing defensive line. Yeah, you get Mason Smith back, who's a former 5-star, excellent player. Guy's going to be a problem. He's coming off a season-ending injury, and you never know what you're going to get from a guy like that. But you lose Ali Gay, you lose Ojolari, you lose a lot of these high-end guys. Now, of course, you got Harold Perkins at linebacker. Guys, one of the best linebackers in all of college football, is going to be a problem. Their secondary appears to kind of be in shambles right now, which to me, when you're looking at a really great passing offense team like Florida State, that makes my mouth water. So, man, to me, I like Florida State in this one. I picked them to upset them last year, and I think it's going to happen again this year.
I agree with you. I definitely think Florida State has the horses to do that. And I definitely think this is considering they have a sketchy secondary, cornerbacks are not great, and they're dismissed from the team, having a lot of issues off the field. There's just a lot of factors that go into it, specifically them being in Orlando, primarily a home environment for Florida State at this point. Hopefully it's going to be about 70-30, hopefully 65-35, somewhere in that nature. But Florida State's definitely going to be ready to play, and they're not going to give Brian Kelly the energy to have his little revival, as you could say, in his second year.
Yeah, like you said, I don't keep scores. I settle them. Like, okay, well, you might want to keep scoring that first game because hopefully Florida State runs it up. And, I mean, really, when you look at it last year, the game should have been about 35-17. Mm-hmm. Everybody from LSU makes excuses like, man, I tell you what, I hope we go to the SEC because when you talk about, like, what we do covering, like, man, I post something about Florida State and it does pretty well, but you post something about LSU and I posted something and I think we're at like 400-something comments and it's probably 80% LSU fans. So, like, they're confident. They are really confident. They think they are going to blow Florida State out this year. And they think that Florida State has not gotten any better. They said last year they don't lose in the Superdome and this, that, and the other, and they went in and beat them. So, I mean, you can't ask for a better way to open up the season. I think the exciting thing about that game is if you win it, is excellent. It's great. It puts you in the national conversation. If you lose that game, all of your goals, in our opinion, maybe in the national championship still, all that's still on the table. You could even see them again down the road in the playoff picture. But I think that's a fun thing about that game is it's kind of a win-win either way. But I know you're going to be there. It's going to be a crazy environment. I wish the stadium was a little bigger. I do feel like they missed the ticket with making this a home and home. I would have loved to have had it in Doak and in Tiger Stadium. I think they missed that. Hopefully, when we make it to the SEC, we can do that. But yeah, that's going to be a really exciting game, and I like Florida State in that one. So Southern Miss, we won't spend a ton of time on it. Frank Gore Jr., forget the rest. Florida State's going to win that one, I believe. I mean, they lost to Miami last year, 30-7. Florida State destroyed Miami. Southern Miss, they're a scrappy team, but they're just going to be outmanned in that game. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or we'll just kind of roll on.
I agree. Frank Gore Jr. is about the only thing they have on that offense.
Yep, yeah, they're struggling to find some things. So and again, guys, if you want to further break down, like I literally wrote 1,100 words on North Alabama. Go check it out. It's on the website. Boston College. This game, I feel like Boston College to me is this team everybody's sleeping on this year that I think is going to be better than like the most improved, if you want to call it that. I don't like that it's on the road right before Clemson. I don't like that it's their red bandana game that they always play well in. It is at noon, so that kind of takes the crowd aspect out of it a little bit. But Boston College, their offensive line was awful last year. They came into the season with only 4 starts. This year, I think it's 137. They should be fully rebuilt. I think their quarterback, I'm not a guy who's ever been really sold on Dracovic. I think their guy came in through for 250 yards in the last 3 out of 4 games. I think Boston College is going to be improved. They have an old past 1,000-yard rusher in Garwo. I still just think even then they're going to be outmatched, and I think Florida State is going to be able to win this game comfortably and kind of rest those starters a little bit, get back home, and get ready for that Clemson game.
Yeah, I agree. I think Garwo is a really, really nice running back for them. I think they're going to establish the run early and often. Can Florida State be able to not look ahead of their matchup? And Jeff Halfley, for example, is pretty much on the hot seat at Boston College. Everybody thought that was a tremendous hire for Boston College. I definitely think he's a great coach,
Right.
but he is kind of in a rough spot right now, especially losing your quarterback going over to Pittsburgh, and we'll kind of discuss that a little bit later. But just overall, I think Boston College is kind of in rebuild mode, and I think Florida State's going to take advantage of this, and I give Florida State the win.
Yep. And now Clemson. This is the big one. This is the most, I
Yep.
don't care what anybody says about LSU. LSU might be the biggest game. This is the most important game by far. I think Florida State needs to top Clemson. They need to win the ACC. And the reason I struggle so much with this game is now we know stuff happens, like
Mm-hmm.
injuries, things like that. Florida State could lose a game they're not supposed to. But if they stay healthy and if they win every game, in my point of view, if I'm predicting them to beat LSU, and then I say that they're going to go to Death Valley and beat Clemson, and we say that nothing else strange out of the ordinary we don't expect happens, that means you're predicting them to go undefeated. And so to predict a team that was 5-7 2 years ago to now go 12-0 and undefeated in the regular season, it feels like a stretch, but I, as much as I just want to say it with my chest out that we're going to do it, I struggle because I have mixed feelings on this game. So I feel like getting Clemson early benefits Florida State. You have a young quarterback who's taking over,
Mm-hmm.
and you can read further about it in a breakdown that I did. But with the case with Klubnik, he really played well against North Carolina. North Carolina doesn't play defense at all.
No.
When you look at Tennessee, they are a run-stopping defense. He did okay. He looked like a true freshman in the Orange Bowl. Happy feet, got sacked through some picks and things like that. But he has done really well against teams that don't play good passing defense. So, this is by far going to be the toughest passing defense that he's faced so far. You get him in a new system. Now, he told me at ACC Media Days it's similar to the offense that he ran in high school. So it hasn't really been, hey, now look, the guy, Garrett Riley came out and said lethal simplicity. So I don't know,
PTSD.
man,
Yeah.
ACC championship, book it. But, I do think Clemson's going to be interesting because I think getting them early is beneficial to Florida State before Klubnik has that time to get in rhythm. But it also makes it harder in the rematch of the ACC championship if it happens. Now, of course, Clemson still has a great defensive line. They have two good running backs, but they also have some underwhelming receivers. So is that good offensive line? Are they even going to be able to take advantage of a better passing quarterback? I don't know. But again, like we talked about, you have two of the best linebackers in the country in Trotter, and I forget the other guy's name, but then you have some great defensive linemen, but you got to go win at Death Valley, and it's hard. It's hard. They haven't lost an ACC game up there since 2016 when Pitt upset them. But they did have their 40-game home win streak snapped last year by South Carolina. They've lost 3 games in back-to-back seasons. They've been beatable. Syracuse took them to the wire last year at home, and then Florida State went a couple games later and beat them by 35 points. I don't know, dude. I can't I want to pick Florida State so bad, but it just, it's hard when, like I said, that means you're basically saying they're going to go undefeated. So make me feel more confident about this game.
I can't really because I think Shipley is going to be kind of the X factor in this game once again. I think with a newer quarterback, you're going to have to kind of rely on the run game as we've come through. And the biggest difficulty that I saw when I watched that game last year live in Tallahassee in Doak Campbell Stadium was that middle 8 that Clemson always talks about, starting really, really quickly in that last 4 minutes of the first half, turning it over to the first 4 minutes of the second half. Absolutely killed Florida State with 20 unanswered points at that point. And Florida State was kind of in a panic mode at that point.
Yep.
And I mean, when you're at home, you're trying to get the crowd involved. It's going to be a night game more than likely, unless Clemson or Florida State just self-destructs this season. Pretty much, Clemson does what Clemson does. They have championship experience. And whether you love or hate Dabo Swinney, he has been in these tremendous games. He has won a national championship.
Yep.
Or one of those 4 coaches that I talked about winning a national championship. And he's wanting to get Clemson back on the map. And I think overall, if it was later in the season, I really wouldn't give Florida State any chance at all, just because of how that place is later in the season. But just overall, I think Florida State has a chance to be successful, but I just think it's too much in terms of an environment that you're not kind of adjusted to. And I think this program itself in Florida State is still growing to try to set that culture of a winning foundation.
Right, and I think people see Clemson, the cracks in the foundation,
Yeah.
and is it cracks in the foundation? They've had to replace some coordinators. They don't have Venables anymore. They don't have
Yeah.
a couple of the guys that were there for the national championship season. It could be. Their down year was only 9-0 in the ACC championship in an Orange Bowl, and I actually had here since he went 6-7 in 2010, and I want to throw up
Yeah.
even talking about this, but you got to respect it because they've gone 142-24 with 12 consecutive 10-win seasons, 8 ACC titles, 6 playoff appearances, and 2 national championships since. That's a freight train, and you have to run headfirst into it and beat it. Now, if Florida State were to be able to go into Death Valley and upset them, I think this is the year they can do it. I think you have a more experienced quarterback. I think you have the defensive line that can maybe bottle that run game up. I don't think they quite have the passing game to get you. And like you said, you lost that game in about 2.5 to 3-4 minutes, when you gave up the 20 points. Last year, I think the first one they got, the touchdown, was Antonio Williams, the freshman receiver down the sideline. When you watch the replay, it was a miscommunication. I know Zaria was in there. They just lost track of him, and he got behind him. So, Florida State has closed the gap. You went from 59-10 reading books in the stands to now it was like it's getting closer on the field. You actually have a higher blue chip ratio right now in your recruiting class in 2024 than Clemson does. So like you're getting close. It's just, man, Death Valley is a hard place to win. Point blank. It just is what it is. They haven't won there since 2013, but I do think I do have them beating Clemson in the ACC championship in a rematch. But, man, I think this is going to be the one that I'm going to pick Florida State to drop this game. But I think it's going to be close, so I don't think it necessarily hurts you. Now, that rematch is not guaranteed, so the Death Valley game is very important. You got a team like Louisville who plays basically nobody that could sneak their way in, or North Carolina or whatever. So Clemson still is at a 70% blue chip ratio. So they still have a lot of talent. They are loaded, but I think Florida State can win. I just think being in Death Valley and what they have might be a little bit too much. So next up, Virginia Tech. Don't have to spend a ton of time on them. Year 2 for Brent Pry. Their offense was worse than bad. It's just all bad on offense for them guys. Their quarterback is a struggle this year. They don't really know who they're naming as a starter. They bring in a nice receiver from Old Dominion who actually beat them last year. Their defense is okay. Virginia Tech just really, since they joined the ACC, they had some early success and then has really fallen apart as a program ever since. I think it's going to be, look, I got to admit, back in 2018, I was swag surfing in the stands. I was ready, and then it like someone let all the air out of the balloon. So I'm hoping that this is payback for 2018. I hope we run up on Virginia Tech.
Yeah, we'll just point to monitor here. It's coming off a bye week. You're probably exhausted from that Clemson game, possibly your first loss of the season. Maybe not. Maybe a huge win. But it's an emotional roller coaster coming off a bye week at this point. You have to stay focused in this game. You're coming off that, coming back home. I think it's very important to go ahead and get this win, and I definitely think Florida State will handle business as we go through this.
Definitely. And I do think the bye week there does help coming off that Clemson game. So next up is Syracuse. You get them at home this year. You blew them out last year. They lose. They bring back Garrett Schrader, who's turned into a nice quarterback, but they lose an All-American running back in Sean Tucker. They do have a really good hybrid wide receiver tight end in Gadsden, but they just don't really have a lot of talent on defense. They lost Deuce Chestnut. Of course, you're going to see him at LSU game 1.
Yeah.
But to me, again, I just think them coming into Tallahassee where they've never won, they've never beat Florida State in Tallahassee. I think this is another one you can chalk up as a win for Florida State.
Yeah, ironically enough, I actually had us losing to Syracuse last year. So
yeah, oh man, that really fired up some people too.
Yeah, and they started off really great, 6-0 season. It started great, and then they tapered off very, very quickly. And you started to see the injuries stack up, lack of depth. There was just a lot of different things that were factored into it. Florida State doesn't do a great job against mobile quarterbacks, specifically Garrett Schrader, because in Tallahassee, he had a field day there for a while. But I definitely think Florida State's going to get their revenge here, especially considering it's at home.
Yeah, we definitely have struggled with mobile quarterbacks for just seems like forever, which makes me nervous about game one with
Yeah.
Jaden Daniels. I'll be honest with you, man. After watching the SEC championship, I'm glad Nussmeier's on the bench
Yep.
and
I
not
agree.
throw, because I thought that would be the more, when I saw him play before Jaden Daniels said he was coming back, I was like, oh man, we
Mhm.
might be in trouble here.
Yep.
When I celebrated probably more than LSU fans when Jaden Daniels said he was coming back. Now he's an elite scrambler, but yeah,
Yeah.
Q's could start 4-0 again this year. The toughest game, they don't have a early schedule that's very hard, so the competition will ramp up quickly for them down the road. So, but I do think they'll get off to another start. But Dino Babers just really hasn't done a whole lot. That was the most talented team they've had during his time at Syracuse, and Florida State still blew them out. So next up, Duke, one of the most interesting games on the schedule. A lot of people got this team really, watch out. They say you could watch out for this game. It's going to be tougher than it looks. I personally am on the other side of the fence for this. Now, we're going to learn a lot. I love that they play Clemson at home week one.
Mhm.
Yes, you take the Death Valley factor out of it, but I think we're going to learn a lot about both Clemson and Duke in week one. See, now, Duke last year, they played basically nobody. They had the 96 strength of schedule ranking. They beat, I was like multiple 3-win teams, a 1-win Northwestern team, an FCS team. I mean, I think they beat UCF in the bowl game, which was like a good win for them. They beat Wake, who Florida State lost to, but Wake had a late season collapse.
Yep.
I think Duke has done great with what they have available. They bring back 99.5% of their offensive yardage, which makes it really tough.
Mhm.
But they lose some things on defense, and they've had one, I looked it up earlier, they had one top 50 recruiting class since
Yep.
2018. They had 2 4-star transfers since 2018, and both of them I don't even think are on the roster anymore. Their strength of schedule this year jumps up to 22nd. Their projected wins are only at 6.5. I just think that Duke is going to kind of it's not the Duke of old. You can't just you can't sleepwalk through this game, but I think Duke's coming back to earth in 2023.
Yeah, I'm not going to jinx anything, so
Right,
I'm
right.
gonna keep the record stat to myself. But
Yeah,
coming
yep.
off a homecoming at Doak Campbell Stadium, tremendous quarterback with Leonard coming back again. Mike Elko's done a tremendous job there at Duke to kind of transform that program into, maybe we don't need to worry about postseason basketball tickets anymore. Maybe we might need to
Right.
get a postseason football ticket. So I'm super excited to see how that Duke team kind of handles the week one adversity as we're playing Clemson. It's a good barometer of what they are as a program. But overall, I think later in the season as it goes, they may taper off. And I think that's definitely where Florida State can kind of take advantage there.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, now you look at they get Clemson, Florida State, NC State, Notre Dame, Louisville, and
Yeah.
UNC. I mean, they're
Mhm.
they're improved, but like we said, the talent overall just still lags at a place like
Yeah.
Duke. And they overachieved against a really terrible schedule. And another thing I will point out about Duke is they were plus 16 in turnovers last year, and that is rarely ever repeatable. And Phil
Yeah.
Steele in his preseason magazine, he has where I think it's like over 60% of the time, any team that has double-digit turnovers, and I think it jumps to like 70 something percent in plus 14 or more in turnovers, has a worse record the following year, because there's so much luck that's involved in turnovers that's
Mhm.
hard to replace. So I think just with a weak schedule and a really crazy turnover margin, I think Duke kind of gets a little humble pie this year. But you're trying to install a football culture to basketball school, and I think he's done a really good job. I think Elko could be a problem going forward. Now, they do have a top 50 recruiting class, I believe, this year.
Mhm.
Maybe I might have
Yeah.
to check myself on that. But, they could be something to look forward to in the future. But right now, I'm not going to mention the record either. Knock on wood.
Yeah.
But hopefully it stays that way if you know what we're talking about. Next up, you got a road game. One of the most anticipated games for me that on the schedule. Man, I'm looking for some ACC revenge tour against Wake Forest coming up next. You lose your all-time leading passer in school history, Sam Hartman. You lose A.T. Perry, who is back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, all first-team All-ACC. Now, you bring back a lot of talent at receiver. They have, I think it was 5 receivers that went over 500 yards, 4 receivers that topped 500-yard mark
Yeah.
last year. Donovan Green, Jamal Banks, Taylor Marin. I mean, you got guys that kind of really kind of hurt Florida State last year, but the run game's what killed you last year against them. That stupid slow mesh offense that's so
Yeah.
frustrating to watch. They do bring back Justice Ellison, their top back, but then they lose the next 2. They lose some guys on the offensive line as well. They only return 38% of their yardage. I just really feel like Wake's going to step back. We know they're not defensive dominant. They haven't had a top 50 defense since Elko was there. And so I just really think that they're that quintessential Big 12 team, like we talked about. They win games with offense, and now your
Mhm.
offense just got gutted. And so, unless Mitch Griffith turns out to be the second coming of Sam Hartman, I don't know. I did an episode last year where I think Wake Forest per snap basis had like something combined like crazy, like 15 seasons of experience more than Florida State did. Now those tables have turned. And now Florida State has experience. That experience that carried Wake to an 11-win season in 2021 is gone. A lot of it is gone. And so I think it's time to take the ACC revenge tour up to Winston-Salem and deliver a little bit of a beatdown to Wake Forest.
Yeah, I will say I'm almost considering going up there just to go to Snuggy Hill just so I can
Yeah.
bask in the glory of like a 59-3 win because
Yes.
this team is gutted, unfortunately.
Yep.
Biggest problem that I have in this all factoring in is Florida State has had some difficulties beating Wake Forest. They've lost the last three matchups that they
Yep.
played against them. And when you look at that going forward, I mean, you have a road game that we're going to talk about in just a second against Pittsburgh coming up, and that seems to be kind of the most treacherous path there, and the most treacherous game through that 8-game stretch. And I mean, yes, they did lose A.T. Perry and a couple other guys on that offense side of the ball, but they still have a lot of playmakers that can be able to be efficient. And, just kind of you have to hone in on what you're doing. And coming off that homecoming high against hopefully a win against Duke,
Yep.
you definitely need to continue to develop and go through those processes together as a program and understand that this is a place you haven't won and you don't win this game very often. You need to go ahead and handle business now while you can and go ahead and move to the next game. And I think that's definitely what Florida State's going to do in this is they kind of factor in trying to take care of business early on.
Definitely. And, like you said, they're on a 3-game losing streak, and you can never overlook Wake Forest. Like, I
Mhm.
have to give it to them. I'm not a big fan of their coach. He's kind of
Yeah,
he's become a little arrogant, you know what I mean? But at the same time, for the smallest Power 5 school in the country, they have really overachieved in the last few years. But, I think I had a stat where they had only had one or two winning seasons in the 10 years prior to Sam Hartman
Mhm.
arriving. So I do think they take a step back. This is a game I would have liked to have seen a little earlier on the schedule because
I
now
agree.
they will have some time to get that rhythm. But my high school coach used to have a saying that you smash a gnat with a sledgehammer because you don't want to let them hang around and get in your face. So, like you said,
Yep.
I think with Florida State, you come out and you end it early, as early as you can. You don't even give them the hope of hanging around. They got some weapons. Your secondary's going to have to be tested a little bit here with this receiving core, but I do think Florida State gets the win at Wake Forest. Like you talked about, the next one, this is the trap game on Florida State's schedule, what everybody says. Now, the thing about Pitt, they lost a lot, and when I went through and looked at it, like they lose quarterback one, they lose their leading wide receiver, they lost their leading running back, who was extremely productive.
Mhm.
You lose your top defensive tackle. You lose so many guys off this team. You bring in Dracovic, who does work with the offensive coordinator Frank Zanetti, that was with him at Boston College in 2020. He had his best season there. He can steady the ship at quarterback. But when you look at Pitt, I mean, they had a really good quarterback situation, Kenny Pickett. Ever since then, you had 3 guys start a game last year. One transferred out. One doesn't even play football anymore. So, Djokovic has never really blown me away,
Yeah.
but now he actually has an offensive line to play behind. So we'll see how that goes. But you got a lot to replace on the
Mhm.
offensive side of the ball. It's on the road. It might be cold. I even looked up the weather for Pitt, and it's like it's a November 4th on history is a high of 55 and a low of 37. That's not terrible. Could be kind of cold. Pitt always has a good defensive line. They have a lot to build around. I looked it up, and while they only return one starter, almost every guy they bring back is a fifth-year senior from their depth players. And they've been 4-0 in November the last 2 years. So those are the things that make me nervous. But I think Florida State has a talent edge here. I think they have higher end pieces. I think they beat Pitt, but you think about it, last year they beat West Virginia. They took Tennessee to the wire. Had their quarterback not have got injured, they probably beat Tennessee in that game. But then a couple games later, they lose as a 22-point favorite to Georgia Tech. So they're sneaky good, but oddly inconsistent. But don't sleep on Pitt, because ask Clemson how that works out. So give me your thoughts on Pitt.
Yeah, back-to-back road games always important to understand there. You understand the colder weather, understanding Narduzzi as a coach, physicality is kind of his MO that we have through him, and Dracovic as a guy that Florida State's had his number for quite some time now at this point. Very consistent quarterback, proven veteran, but problem is he's kind of struggled against Florida State at this point. And I definitely think when you kind of factor all that in, I think Florida State understands what it has to do to kind of get to that next stage and being able to beat the crap out of Miami the next week. You need to kind of hone in on what you need to do as a program. And like I said with the Wake, you have to understand the expectations that you have as a program, specifically if you have 1 or 0 losses at this point, that you have to keep moving forward in the season. I definitely think that's what Florida State does. And quite frankly, I don't even think this game is going to be that close. I think Florida
Really.
State kind of gets it done here, and I think it's not going to be that much of an issue.
I could definitely see that just from all the losses. It's just, Pitt is just a tricky team, but I definitely think they're going to win. I don't think it's going to be like an overtime or anything close like
Yeah,
that. I just may not be a runaway, but I do think I do like what you're thinking there. As long as the weather's on your side, maybe it's not
yeah,
like cold and rainy, and
hmm
you don't look ahead to Miami. I think they're fine here.
yeah,
I'm not as worried about Pitt as other people are. Once I
yeah,
started looking at Pitt and looking at,
hmm
you lost that wide receiver, you lost that running back, and you don't have those guys coming back this year. So I do think they get that one there. Next up, Miami. We got to put,
yeah, yeah,
this.
yeah,
I'm so excited about this game. You get them in Doak. Like you said, it's probably going to be the biggest home game of the year, especially with the next one being North Alabama, whatever. But this is going to be the biggest one. Hopefully it's a night game. Doak's going to be rocking. I'm sure whether it's a night game or not, it's going to be huge. You ran them out of their stadium last year. I don't think it's going to quite be a 42-point win this year. I do think the offensive coordinator they brought in will be better working with Tyler Van Dyke, who we've seen in the past has the potential to be a good quarterback. But my problem with Miami is they did good in the portal on the offensive line. They have a quarterback that has potential. Wide receiving core, very pedestrian. They lose Will Mallory, their number 1 target last year. They really don't have anybody coming back that's very impressive. Their running back situation is kind of the same. Defensive line, they have a good defensive line. I'll give them that.
yeah.
Linebackers, kind of below average. Secondary, got 2 good safeties, lost both corners that started for them last year, 2 top corners. So, they got a higher blue chip ratio or whatever, but Miami has done less with more for a really long time. That is like their special, is doing less with more. Mario Cristobal, to me, I'm really not sold on as being like the second coming of Nick Saban, like everybody made
Yeah.
him out to be. I think I actually made the reference when he took over Oregon. I think he got handed the keys to a Corvette that had a flat tire. They were like 89 and 18 before they took over, minus the 1 bad season they had. He got freaking Justin Herbert as his quarterback.
Yep.
Without Justin Herbert, they're like 1-5, I think it is, against ranked teams.
hmm
You just got to see it. The in-game decisions are kind of questionable. They were bringing an air raid coordinator, but is Cristobal going to force them to run the ball? They only ran it like, I think, 46% of the time with Justin Herbert or past 46% of the time with Herbert at quarterback at Oregon. Miami should be better this year. To me, until I see it from Miami, I'm not sold on Miami. And I think Florida State's going to win comfortably, just maybe not by 42.
I agree. I don't think they're going to win by 42, but I think they are going to win pretty comfortably. I think it's always worrisome to deal with Tyler Van Dyke because I do think he is a talented quarterback. They're bringing in a new offense coordinator, but like you said, the schemes may not kind of match up in terms of what it is. We all thought that Josh Gaddis was a tremendous coordinator, and the fans were saying, "Oh, he is a tremendous get."
Yep.
And sure enough, it fired in their face again because that's just kind of the program that they are at this point. They kind of have to understand that before you play Florida State, as Florida State fans most know, they play at NC State. And we all know how difficult of a place that is to win,
Yep.
considering I've been there 3 times and I've seen them lose every single time I've been there. It is not a fun place to play.
No.
And Miami fans are going to kind of look at that and say, okay, well, we might be, 6-4 going into the matchup. Is it really that important to win this game or, and stuff like that? And yes, Miami fans claim about off-season champs and everything else. And I know their life wallet money with John Louise is kind of running out a little bit.
Yep.
And that program's kind of going downhill a little bit more in terms of recruiting now. But I think overall, I think Florida State understands what's at hand at this point. They want to absolutely destroy this program to a different
Yep.
level. And I think Mike Norvell understands that. And I definitely think they're going to be ready to play as we go through. And I have them winning another game at home against a Miami team that we saw the last time in Doak Campbell Stadium what happened with the game winning play there. But this will not be that kind of situation again.
Yeah, because last year the game-winning play was what, 2 minutes into the game or
Yeah.
something like that, and I do agree. I think that it's interesting because and they got a new defensive coordinator as well, who may
Mhm.
be a sneaky
Yep.
good hire. Like, I think he's a
Yeah,
sneaky good hire. I've heard
I
some
agree.
people say that they think Houston's guy, the new offensive coordinator may be overrated. But yeah, I do think knowing that it's a pivotal time, like we talked about earlier in recruiting, I think
Mhm.
Norvell knows that if you can smash Miami again this year, you talk about a bad year on the field last year. Their recruiting has slipped ever since. Their NIL money might not be competitive anymore. So Miami, to me, this is a very pivotal year for Miami. If you put together another stinker on the field, yeah, I'm not. I don't think they're in a position to fire Cristobal because they put so much into
Yeah,
getting him there. But I think the new car smell will be gone, and I think they may struggle. They may struggle going forward. I also like that you point out that one thing that I always laugh about, the All Canes Conference, that they have yet to win, even though they've been sheltered in the Coastal Division, which has been really a terrible division for a long
mhm.
time. So now they don't get that benefit anymore. Secondary to that, I'm so thankful we don't have to play NC State this year in
I
Raleigh.
agree.
I hate going up there. But yeah, I definitely think this is a pivotal year. And I think Norvell knows that you kind of got the state of Florida in a chokehold right now. So if you can just kind of get the knockout blow, and I think you have a good chance of delivering that against Miami this year. North Alabama, we won't really even talk too much about that. 1-10 last year. They played one FBS team, one Group of Five team in Memphis. They lost 59-0. It is a new coaching staff this year. So, maybe they see a little bit of an improvement. They have a couple Power Five transfers, but to me, this is a glorified bye week. I said in my preview, I wouldn't, unless you want to give them a final send off for senior day. I don't even think you dress Jared Verse or Jordan Trout. I don't even think you put them on the field for this game. Don't risk it. Let them rest up between Miami and Florida. I think this is a name your score type of game. I think we see Brock Glenn in this game. I think we get deep into the depth chart. Any thoughts on North Alabama other than it's going to be
That's it.
ugly?
Yeah, it's gonna be pretty a cakewalk pretty much.
Yeah, definitely. So next up, Florida. This is a very interesting game because I think Florida's going to be bad this year. I don't think they're going to take any kind of step forward this year. When you look at Anthony Richardson, kept them in a lot of games last year. They now don't have that dual threat. I think the interesting thing for Florida is you lose the running threat at quarterback, but you don't really bring in a passing threat that erases that. Like you bring in Graham Mertz from Wisconsin, didn't throw the ball a whole lot there, just topped 2,000 yards for the first time in I think 4 or 5 year career last year. He may be perfect for them because they are going to run the ball a lot. He's going to be the perfect kind of guy. He's used to handing it off. They have two quality backs. They lost a lot on the offensive line. I don't think the transfers that they brought in, like Miami, I give them credit. They did well in the portal on the offensive line. Florida, I think the ones going out are better than the ones you have coming in.
Yeah.
Wide receiver here again, pedestrian group, nobody really that blows you away on top of a quarterback that may not be a great passing quarterback. You got to go into the swamp. You haven't won there in a little while. I think 2017 maybe.
Mhm.
Their defense was awful last year. Now they got incredible size up front with some of the guys they brought in that are 400 pounds and pushing 400 pounds. They got huge size. Defense just not that great. Tough to win on the road. Game was closer than it should have been last year. This year, I don't see that being the case. And one thing I will say about Florida, you know, again, you talk about pivotal time in the state of Florida. They have the number one toughest schedule in 2023, and it's top five again in 2024. The Gators could be in for 2 really long years ahead of them. Their experience rank coming back this year by Phil Steele is 109th. They're only projected to have 5.5 wins. Man, they're predicted to win 50.3%, which is laughable to me.
Yeah.
But man, I just really I think the Gators take a big step back this year. And I will say, Florida State gets a glorified bye week, right? We talked about that. North
Yeah.
Alabama. Florida's going to be coming off a stretch of neutral site Georgia, Arkansas at home, at LSU, and at Mizzou, who's going to be a sneaky good team this year.
Yep.
I mean, if they haven't quit yet, it might. I don't know. Give me your thoughts on Florida.
I'll give you a couple of thoughts. I'm going to be putting in win totals this upcoming weekend, but
Right.
I'm smashing the under 5.5 for Florida.
Yeah. Yep.
Smashing it and won't even think anything about it. They're going to be one of the worst teams in the SEC East, and that's with Vandy. Might
Yep.
I add that they lost to last year. Yeah, they're not a very good team at all. Graham Mertz cannot throw the football effectively at all. They probably have one of the better rushing offenses in the country, but it won't really matter too much because they don't really have a lot of viable players on the outside at the receiver position that's going to be that great. Defensive line, they're solid. Linebackers are solid. I mean, it's just they're just an okay team, I guess. And when you're factoring in playing at Mizzou and at Georgia and Arkansas and LSU, I mean, there's a lot of games there where they can actually be able to lose. And this isn't coming from a rival fan base. This is just honestly
Right.
just this team is not very good. And hopefully Napier can have that recruiting class develop and gel together as he goes through his next season. But this one is probably not going to be a year to remember. And I think Mike Norvell is going to make sure that that game last year against Florida was closer than you would like to expect. This year, you don't have Anthony Richardson to kind of back yourself into a corner with. And now you're kind of figuring out the pieces, and definitely think Florida State's going to take advantage, even in a swamp that's going to have a pretty good environment as we go through. And maybe that might be Florida battling for bowl eligibility at that point. Maybe they're 5-6 and they have to kind of get a bowl. And I definitely think Florida State is going to crush their dreams in terms of doing a bowl eligibility.
I hope so. Payback from a few years ago.
Yeah.
And I will say, I think unlike Cristobal necessarily, I think Napier's actually a decent coach. I think he just kind of got a tough situation with a really hard schedule. I think they had 6 ranked opponents last year. The next 2 years don't get any easier. And I think they are in a tough spot where you lost a lot of your veteran quality players last year. You had a good recruiting class, but they're still young. So you're either going to have to ride with some mid to below average players, or you're going to have to play those young guys. And either way, that's not necessarily a recipe for success. And that's why I think Florida does take a big step back this year. I'm like you. I think 5.5 wins is being a little bit generous. And I think Florida State is going to go in and, drain the swamp or whatever you want to call it. I think it's going to be a great way to end the season. I don't think it's going to be as close. I just think they don't have the horses to hang with FSU this year. Of course, it's a rivalry game, so you never know.
Of course.
And to wrap things up here, I know you said you're going to do your win projections, so I don't want to have you give away any secret sauce. Me personally, I have Florida State going 11-1. I think what I did last year was, because it was so hard to really kind of call some of these games, I did like a ceiling and a floor and a most likely. I have Florida State with a ceiling of 12-0. I think they can win every game on the schedule if they stay healthy, if things go their way. I think their floor is around 8-4, given some things, maybe some guys get dinged up or miss some time or something like that. But I think overall, just walking into this season, whether Florida State wins a national championship or not, whether they make the playoffs or not, I think Florida State football is fun again. And I think that is what is the big takeaway. That you can go into every Saturday or Sunday in the case of LSU, and you can stand toe-to-toe and compete with those teams. And I think that's what makes it fun this year. I think you've seen the momentum carry into recruiting. I think a big year this year sets them up well for 2024. Of course, they might take a step back, losing a lot of these veteran pieces, but you're going to get your young guys more experience. So, with that being said, if you have any other additional thoughts on 2023, just like I said, Florida State football is fun again, and it's almost time, ready to be back. I'm ready to be in Doak Campbell Stadium this year. I'm excited. I think we got some new LED light upgrades that we saw. I got season tickets this year, so I'll see you at a couple games. We definitely got to meet up down there at Doak. So just any final thoughts on the 2023 season?
Man, it's going to be a year to remember. And, you're seeing Fabian Lovett, Jared Verse, Jordan Travis. They're all coming back for another year. That isn't by coincidence. This team is going to be really, really fantastic to watch. Super excited to see how everything plays out. Home schedule's not great, as we talked about before, but we're going to make the most of it when we make Miami kind of, bow down to us at that point. And I definitely think Florida State's going to have some remarkable performances this season. I definitely think that everything's going to kind of pan out the way Florida State fans would like. As I've alluded to before, I do think my record prediction is going to be 11-1. I think that's a pretty safe assumption at this point. I definitely think Florida State can take care of advantages that they have throughout this season. And I definitely think Mike Norvell has his team right on track for what it could be a sensational 2023 season.
Most definitely. And like we said, it's fun again. And I know the home schedule isn't the most exciting for season ticket holders. You don't really get the big game in there, but I'm not mad at if they go undefeated at home.
Mhm.
You get back on a home win streak and defending Doak. I think that's really important this year. And of course, that brings, people want to go to games when they win. So I think you're going to get the fan support there. It's going to be exciting. I mean, in 2013, when they were good, that stadium was full all the time. I think people are going to come out regardless of some of the games. You might struggle with North Alabama, but, I just think that the hype and excitement around this team, you're going to see a lot play out and fan support this year. So, man, I'm so excited. We're so close to the season. I'm ready to kick off. I'm just, it's been a long time since we felt this way about FSU football coming into the
Yep.
season. And, I've said before that last year I was cautiously optimistic because I thought they could, but they had to see if they can. This year I'm
Mhm.
almost nervously excited because I know they can, but will they? And
Yeah.
so I'm really excited for it. But I really do appreciate you coming on. This ran a lot longer than I thought it was. But I
Yeah.
guess the show's been a year in the making. This is kind of going to be like a full on season preview for
Yeah.
me, I guess. But yeah, man, I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for spending so much time with us, and tell the people where they can find you.
Oh yeah, man. Go ahead and follow me over at Norvell Central. I'm posting on Instagram. I have about almost 18,000 followers on there. Trying to get my content up pretty quickly on Instagram. Twitter, I'm at about 6,000. Trying to get as much content as I can. Even on Facebook, a little bit more too. YouTube, I'm posting a little bit every so often. But most of my content, you can be able to find me at Norvell Central, Central Norvell on Twitter as well, trying to put out as much content as I can, and hopefully I can be at least half the creator that Plant the Spirit can be over there, because he does a tremendous job, and I know each and every one of you enjoy his content. I know that he is going to be putting out the work as we go through this season, and it's going to be something to remember. So
I do appreciate that. I do the best I can. It's a one man band, as I know you are too.
yeah,
Sometimes you almost wish for no breaking news so you can just kind of get caught up on things. But
but
I mean, guys, if you're not following, like they said, was it Jalen said, if you're not following Norvell Central, what are you doing? You know what I
yeah,
mean? You got to get on this follow train because man, he covers everything from recruiting to game previews to game recaps. I mean, I don't know how he finds the time to do all this amazing content that he does. He's also helping out over at Chop Chat and things like that this season. So a lot of big things coming for Florida State, a lot of big things coming for us. Just an exciting year ahead. And again, I appreciate you being on.
of course, man. Go Noles, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their night.
Awesome. Thank you. And go Noles, guys.